Take it.
Yeah.
It's over here.
Sometimes, you know, you're here and you walk up and, and the person who's hosting takes away your speech.
No, I won't do it.
Yeah, not so far.
Okay.
I don't think it's anything.
All right. All right, thank you. Appreciate you doing that. King. And the last 3 years, and next year, which will be the 45th anniversary of that assassination, we are going to be in New York again at the Dr. Betty Shabazz and Malcolm X Memorial and Educational Center with a panel about Malcolm X's assassination. So we try to cover the major political assassinations of the 60s. We keep pushing for release of files and release of the history. COPA began some time ago as an effort to gather the research community together, to work on projects together, to oversee the release of the JFK assassination files under the JFK Records Assassination Act, and we had some impact on that. And we're also currently working on what we hope will be an introduction finally this year of a new Martin Luther King Records Act that will release the files on the life and death of Dr. King. And we have two people in the key subcommittee and committee posts who were former members of the Congressional Black Caucus and were co-sponsors when it was introduced under Cynthia McKinney when I worked for her, and both of them want to get the bill moving. So when you have the two chairs, there's a good chance you'll get a hearing. And so we're along. We don't have a number yet or co-sponsors, but we got the right people working on it, and it potentially could release hundreds of thousands of records regarding Dr. King. The House Select Committee on Assassination Records on JFK are for the most part released, but not the pages, hundreds of thousands of pages on Dr. King, and there are many other records that relate to that assassination. And we keep pushing at these conferences to get each year the best new evidence and new research, forensic and ballistic medical evidence, and the authors that are doing the good work, and we've got a great lineup this year. We're going to be here tonight. The rest of the weekend we are at the Hotel Lawrence over at the corner of Houston and Jackson Streets, just down from Dealey Plaza. But we traditionally have come to the Adolphus for the keynote speech, and we did that tonight. If you're here and looking for a restroom, it's straight to the back and all the way to the right, just for your convenience. If you're looking for a good lecture, you found one. We have a full registration as well as a day registration, so you can maybe be coming to this event, maybe you just want to come to one other day at COPA, you can do that. And we this year also commemorated a talk which we do annually in Washington, D.C. on June the 6th that was given in 1963 by President Kennedy regarding the end of the Cold War and the end of the nuclear arms race, and putting himself pretty much at odds with the military-industrial complex full on at that point. And we go to the place where he gave it at American U and commemorate that. We have a lineup, and you should have gotten a schedule outside if you didn't, but we have quite a few speakers going through tomorrow and into Sunday. In addition to that, we will be going out to the grassy knoll to do a moment of silence at 12:30 p.m., which we do annually, and we will that afternoon, for those that are interested, and maybe I could get a raise of hands here, people that are interested in going down to Waco, to Baylor University, to the Pogue Political Library, where the Penn Jones collection and now other researchers' collections have begun to be stored. And Ben Rogers will talk to us about what's there. He's the curator on Sunday. But if people want to take that ride down and have a car that they'd be willing to carpool some of us down, I'm interested to find out who those people are and who wants to go before we hit Sunday. So please come and talk to me about that. And in addition to that, on Sunday night, if you happen still to be here, at 8 o'clock, there's going to be a Discovery Channel special that we're going to watch in the restaurant off the lounge at the Hotel Lawrence. It's two specials, one on JFK and the mob, and one on some new tapes about JFK. We don't expect it to be our quality of broadcast, but we do look at to see how they're propagandizing and spinning
I'm
this.
only watching if Gary Mack is the host.
All right, yeah. I'll tell him that, Jim. But we'll be watching that on Sunday night, and then I was invited on Monday night, if you're still in Dallas, to speak at the Dallas Peace Center, and my topic is there must be some way out of here: the rise of the military-industrial complex, the permanent war economy, and the future and the future of humanity.
There
isn't any way out of here. Well, we'll see. I'll try to invent one. If you're lucky, there'll be a way out of this room at the end. And I should say at the end also, Jim will be signing his book at the rear if people want to buy copies of the book, and that'll be available when after he speaks. But that's pretty much the outline. We do have a resource and book section at the Hotel Lawrence as well, care of and with the help of Andy Winarsic and Last Hurrah Books and Gerald Blow, who's here tonight. And so we have a mix of events, and we've been getting a little bit of mention, I think in large part. John Garrity's here. He's our webmaster and web person, done a great work on the Coalition on Political Assassination site. He's also done social networking through Facebook and YouTube, and so we're starting to be seen by people that haven't seen us before, and some of you may be here because of that. And we're glad for that. Not that we're not glad to see all of our old friends as well, but we do want to get out beyond the choir, and so we're glad for the new people that are coming here. We got a little dishonorable mention by none other than Bruce Sterling, a sci-fi writer. Although I have to say he printed our entire schedule on his blog, but at the top he says, "What the heck kind of society have I lived long enough to see? It's like being live at the witch trials." I don't know. I wrote and asked him what it had to do with witch trials. I said, "Were the witches convicted on ballistic evidence?" Or but even dishonorable mention sometimes, if the person's important enough, I got my dishonorable mention on John McLaughlin when he said that Mel Gibson in the movie Conspiracy Theory portrayed a jacked-up programmed MK Ultra assassin with a John Judge personality. So I said it gave a whole new meaning to conspiracy buff. Kennedy made the talk, and I think it's an important one and fits into what Jim's addressing tonight, at American University in '63, a few months before he was killed. He said, "I've therefore chosen this time and this place to discuss the most important topic on earth, world peace. The United States will never start a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough of war and hate and oppression. Confident and unafraid, we labor on, not toward a strategy of annihilation, but toward a strategy of peace." And his aides said that it was probably one of the most important talks that he gave, and a number of them were enlisted to do that. He talked about having a realistic peace. He said, "What kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about a genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, and not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time." And, he understood very well that they were heading in a direction that could have annihilated life as we know it on the planet, and he was trying to get beyond that. And he said, "Let's not be blind to our differences, but let's direct our attention to common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we can't end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, and we all cherish our children's future, and we're all mortal." So we do go out and commemorate that speech. As many of you know, there are quite a number of new books out on the market about Kennedy and the other assassinations. One interesting one that I invited Ron Goldfarb to come, even though he's written some things I don't like, but he wrote one called In Confidence about secrecy, and he knows about the JFK Records Act and had written a chapter in that. But we had in the last few years. Shane O'Sullivan's great work on Who Killed Bobby, a book and a movie. Michael Morrissey, a longtime researcher, wrote about his correspondence with Vince Salandri in one book and Looking for the Enemy. Lyndon Barston's book, Truth at Last, came out about the King assassination. And Jeff Morley created some stir and still is with Our Man in Mexico about Winston Scott and his current push now to get the records on Joanides. Michael Dobbs did an interesting book, 1 Minute to Midnight, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And all of that, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, have been rewritten by the files that are released by the Kennedy assassination. And many of these books are influenced by the release of those records. There's a new book out about RFK called The Last Campaign, and a book on Jim Garrison by Joan Mellon. Open and Shut Case. We had those people present in Los Angeles, Dr. Robert Joling, a former head of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and Philip von Prague, a audio expert, because they found an actual tape recording of the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And it shows, as many of us knew for a long time, too many shots to have come from Sirhan's gun, probably 13 shots, and 5 from one and 8 from another. And is hard physical evidence of what many of the researchers knew from the photographic and witness evidence, but this is a piece that they shouldn't be able to ignore, but these books come out, and it seems nothing much changes. Wesley Swearingen did To Kill a President. Abraham Bolden, who some people heard from today, wrote an Echoes from Dealey Plaza, and we're going to be able to add him to our agenda tomorrow afternoon, so he's going to come and speak at COPA in a slot that opened up. And also, of course, we've had the other side, anything from Reclaiming History. And when they saw what it was, another book they made him write called 4 Days in November that was greatly truncated. And he had a longer book, I think, on the CD at the back than he had in the 1,000-page doorstopper he wrote in the front. But we've had what I think are misleading books by Legacy of Secrecy, and some of the people you hear from, like Lisa Pease and Jim Diogenio and others, have been critiquing them online and reviewing them for some time. But I just think there's so much out. The 13th Juror just came out, which is a transcript of the Martin Luther King Civil Rights Trial, and very worth the reading, Dr. Pepper's case. And there's books that continue to come. Malcolm Marable, who we're going to try to have up in New York next year, is about to finish a biography of Malcolm X, and I heard him speak, and he'd worked on the assassination and come to the same conclusions that the research community had. So we have friends that arise, and even the speaker tonight, we expect will have several more books about other political assassinations. We don't see them as separate things. We see them as part of a pattern and a design, and in some cases the same modus operandi and even the same operatives. To give you a small example, a medical examiner named Francesco in Memphis, who botched the King autopsy by not doing it, he said to honor the family he wouldn't try to figure out the direction of the bullet, was invited. Luckily, Dr. Noguchi stepped in, but he was actually invited to come to Los Angeles and do the Robert Kennedy autopsy. But that's only one example of what I call, if it ain't broke, you don't fix it. Also, there's other new materials that are coming out in movies. I got one reading that there's some sort of a reading room project at the Sixth Floor Museum that was supposed to open this year. I don't know if it did or not, but there's a lot of stuff at the Sixth Floor Museum that researchers had wanted to see but haven't been able to see, and I don't know if they'll put it in the reading room or not, but yeah. I could try to find out. Another person I invited to come was Antoinette Giancana's daughter. And I like comic relief once in a while, but she didn't like the idea, I guess, so, or else they're coming tonight and I don't know it. There's a book called The Kennedy Assassination 24 Hours After, which is a study about the response immediately that has details in it. There's just responses online to Bugliosi that I think are worth reading themselves. Jim's does, and I think the Fonzie, and so that goes on. There's at least one surviving periodical, JFK Deep Politics Quarterly by Walt Brown. There used to be 3 or 4, but something comes out. But I think the internet has replaced this kind of thing with online newsletters and blogs. And the guy who published the book of Ford's memoirs is suing to get JFK assassination files loose and trying to prove that Ford really, thought that there was some kind of a conspiracy and he's having trouble. Hundreds of photos were just released by the Dallas police through a case, and there's a new film out about Kennedy asking, it was called Virtual JFK, Vietnam if Kennedy Had Lived. And it poses that idea. I tried to get them to show it here, but they wanted hundreds of dollars for the showing, so I said, well, we can't do that. Another interesting movie this year that I think is pertinent was the release of Valkyrie, which is a very interesting plot to kill Hitler that involved invoking Hitler's continuity of government plan that would have come in when he was killed by somebody else and using it to blame the SS and take over that way. And I think that that's similar to the plotting of Operation Northwoods and some other things, and that some of the continuity of government plans were and have been still are being usurped by these people. So I think it's worth seeing just to get that idea. I get an online service called WikiLeaks. I don't know about them, but they cover political assassinations. And every day I also Google, and you can get searches of documents on and different sources of information. Of course, now the best information seems to be outside the country, not inside. Another person I invited who couldn't come because of schedule was DA Craig Watkins, the new district attorney last few years here in Dallas, first black district attorney here, and also fairly progressive. He found some documents in Henry Wade's safe and released them, and I thought he would be an interesting person to talk to and also to press for the opening of a grand jury in Dallas to reopen the Kennedy case. We continue to work on getting the files loose from JFK. We've got 6.5 million pages, more released each year, and we press for that. The Nazi War Crimes Records Act is the only other act that outdoes that. They've got over 8.5 million pages. But we'd like to see the King Act get put into place this year. And Bill Kelly, who many of you know, co-founder of COPA and the Committee for an Open Archive, has been pushing for oversight hearings on the JFK Act. My sense of Congress, having been inside it, is that it's not something they'll do in a vacuum, and they don't have enough interest now. But if we can get hearings on Martin Luther King Act, it is based on the JFK Act, and through that we might be able, I think, to get some review of what was done or not done. Here's some deaths this year. An ex-FBI agent died. Maybe you read about this, but I found him pretty interesting, by the name of Ingram, Jim Ingram. Died of pancreatic cancer, 77-year-old retired agent. He worked with the Mississippi Highway Patrol, and he'd been in the agency quite some time. He investigated Klan killings and violent acts in Mississippi regarding Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. He worked on other cases, including the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the 1968 assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King, and the 1978 mass suicide in Guyana of more than 400 followers of Jim Jones, a case that I spent 3 years working on and wrote. So that's another, if it ain't broke, you don't fix it, I think. Just too many investigations that interact. We got a tape that I'm hoping to play this year during movie night, if people want to hear it, of Dr. Martin Luther King, who I found out came to my University of Dayton in 1964 and did a talk urging nonviolence and the power of the ballot, and they've recovered a tape of that, and it's very moving to hear him speak. And as I said, there are other things that continue to come out on the other political assassinations, and I know that we had a presentation in the past by Jim Douglas at COPA about the Malcolm X assassination, which he's done work on and plans to write about in the future, along with, he just told me he's working on one on Gandhi's assassination, 1947. That's got important political overtones, and also on the assassination of Robert Kennedy and King. So he's got his work cut out for him. Another person that died this year that many of you knew is Walter Cronkite. He's called the most trusted man in America, but I remember him standing in Dealey Plaza in 1967, looking up at the window and saying, it just doesn't seem possible that one man firing from one location could have done so much damage under ordinary circumstances. But these are no ordinary circumstances, he said. He was firing at the President of the United States. And thus the laws of physics suspend. Peter Dell Scott's done a recent article on the CIA deceptions that are coming out through the Joanides case and the attempt to get those records, and that the House Select Committee and others were lied to, and people who were part of the plot were inserted into the investigation, unheard of course. But it's something when it makes the front page of the New York Times. Cyril Wecht, who'll be talking with us later, finally got rid of his charges against him, although it bankrupted him, and they stole all of his investigative papers. Those still haven't been given back. It had nothing to do with what they were charging him with, but they took all of his assassination work, and he's really had a rough time of it for some years, and finally the woman that was after him has stepped down, and she was so bad. I mean, even Spectre excoriated her for saying afterwards that, this doesn't mean when he gets an acquittal, that doesn't mean he's not guilty. I don't know what you have to do to prove it. There was an article that came out through Secrecy News, which you should get if you don't, that the CIA did provide Bay of Pigs files to Nixon, and that those were released to him. Another death this year, of course, of importance in the story is that of Senator Edward Kennedy, the final brother in the family. And while some people may have different views about Edward Kennedy, he did support the JFK Records Act, and he did work to get those files loose. And many of the researchers feel that he was not the person responsible in the Chappaquiddick incident, that he was set up. And a Lieutenant General Victor Krulak died, who worked with Fletcher Prouty and knew Lansdale and fairly high up in Air Force intelligence. And above him was, of course, my favorite person, General Curtis LeMay, smoking his cigar and smiling at the autopsy of John F. Kennedy. One of the spies died by the name of Rolf Kingsley, 91 years old, CIA grandee, they call him. Revived the agency's troubled Soviet division in the late 60s after a paranoid-fueled mole hunt had declined morale. We're talking about James Angleton here. And he was OSS, the precursor to the CIA. He worked in the Middle East and Germany, joined the CIA in '47. He's in Turkey and many other places, and he became a leading voice working to discredit Golitsyn in favor of a far more reliable defector named Yuri Ivanovich Nosenko. So he's gone, not without damage. This was an interesting one that I found. This is a socialite, captivated and charmed. You probably can't see her from all the way back there. She has a nice little Easter hat on and some dolls next to her. And her name is Virginia Warren Daly. And she's popular, it says, with the opposite sex during her life, effervescent and beautiful, and she was the daughter of Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren. And who did she marry? John Charles Daly of What's My Line? Does the name Kilgallen ring a bell? Our old enemies are also still busy, but in strange places. I found an article called "Spy Game Disrupts UFO Disclosure," and it's about Gus Russo writing about the UFOs, and also, guess who else talking about certain types of new technology? Gordon Novell. And so they're busy in the UFO field, I guess. I don't know. What I call unrecognized fascist observatories. And then Alfred McCoy has been doing great work. He did a book on torture, and he has a new one out that I recommend called Policing Empire. And he's talking about counterintelligence innovations like centralized data, covert penetration, disinformation developed during the Army's first protracted pacification campaign in a foreign land in the Philippines from 1898 to 1913 were repatriated to the United States during World War I and became the blueprint for an invasive internal security apparatus that persisted for the next half century. So he's tracing it back to the counterinsurgency wars being brought home, and the loss of democracy here, the buildup of the tremendous surveillance, but he's also talking about the use of biometrics to help them identify people, and the joint expeditionary forensics facilities that are linked to a biometric database in West Virginia, so that a warfighter needs to know one of three things once they see the facial image of the enemy. Do I let him go, do I keep him, or do I shoot him on the spot? and a future is already imaginable in which a U.S. sniper could take a bead on the eyeball of a suspected terrorist, pause for a nanosecond to transmit the target's iris or retinal data via backpack-sized laboratory to a computer in West Virginia, and then, after instantaneous feedback, pull the trigger. And less, he says that seems fanciful. Bob Woodward said the success of the surge was less boots on the ground than bullets in the head, using this high-tech assassination capability. And they said that Woodward compared this to the Manhattan Project in World War II. One intelligence officer using these tools said that the program was so effective it gave him orgasms. And a half a world away from Iraq in the southern Philippines, the CIA Special Forces of the U.S. did an early experiment in the use of aerial surveillance for assassination, and the beginnings of the drones that are being used now. So political assassination is not something in the distant past. It's something that we continue to carry out with new technology all the time. And Seymour Hersh, who I also invited to come and speak, although I don't like Dark Side of Camelot, because of his revelation of Cheney being involved in a current assassination squad. And he said I called him and he said he wanted to do more work before he spoke anymore. He shouldn't have talked so much already. I'm sure not. But he said that it won't matter. I said you could come another year, and he said it won't matter. There won't be a media in the United States in 5 years. And of course, one of the people that implemented that and also covered up the death of Pat Tillman was McChrystal, who's the new general that's in charge of the operations. He's a longtime black operation person in the assassination capability. And of course, one of the effects of decapitation, however it happens, of the executive or the congressional branches is that it throws the country into emergencies and emergency laws and other things, which in fact we just went into recently when Mr. Obama declared a national emergency in relation to swine flu and the H1N1 virus. And that changes many federal laws and allows for many violations of civil liberties. It's not just to make sure that people get to the hospital on time. He worked actively with the Bush administration to develop the new thing that links pandemics to the installation of continuity of government and martial law. When he was in the Senate, he helped draft the legislation there. So, an outbreak of a pandemic can lead to the same thing as a nuclear weapon now. And, of course, you know that they continue to link anybody who believes that there's conspiracies in anything to everybody that believes anything, including, we didn't go to the moon or Obama's not an American or, and whatever else they can come up with, or anybody that's just critical of the government or thinks that the government is not benign is now a conspiracy theorist. And, they try to lump all this together in the articles, and they have psychology that we supposedly follow that, it makes us feel better when we think that there's these powers in place that are killing everybody rather than the lone nuts just go out and do it. Because then it gives us a sense of purpose and a sense of reality. If it was lone nuts, we'd be upset with all the chaos that represented, and so this is a more comforting reality. I hate to tell you, but I don't fluff my pillow at night thinking that, it's better to have a military-industrial complex kill Kennedy than Lee Harvey Oswald. I think it's worse, but lest you think I go about giving people nightmares because I'm a conspiracy theorist, my position is that I wake you up from your nightmare so you understand you're in it. And I think we study political assassinations in the end because they are done for a reason. And the reason is both social change and social control. And that's historic all the way back to Michael Parenti, one of our friends on the left that realizes this such thing as conspiracy. In his book on the assassination of Julius Caesar outlines a much different history of Caesar becoming populist and moving in the direction that people were pushing for, and that the patricians surrounded him and executed him for it, very similar to the Kennedy assassination. But Michael told me he's too old to travel, so he couldn't be here and do it with us. And recently, you may know that Oliver Stone was on the Bill Maher show, and he gave him a copy of the book we're going to be talking about tonight, JFK and the Unspeakable by Jim Douglas. And Stone wrote in a recent article, "The murder of President Kennedy was a seminal event for me and for millions of Americans, and it changed the course of history. It was a crushing blow to our country and to millions of people around the world. It put an abrupt end to a period of misunderstood idealism, akin to the spirit of 1989 when the Soviet bloc began to thaw and 2008 when our new American president was fairly elected. Today, more than 45 years later, profound doubts persist about how President Kennedy was killed and why. My film, JFK, was a metaphor for all those doubts, suspicions, and unanswered questions. Now, an extraordinary new book offers the best account I have read of this tragedy and its significance. That book is James Douglas, JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters. It's a book that deserves the attention of all Americans. It is one of the rare books that, by helping us understand our history, has the power to change it. And the subtitle sums up Douglas's purpose, why he died and why it matters. In his beautifully written and exhaustively researched treatment, Douglas lays out the motive for the Kennedy's assassination. Simply, he traces a process of steady conversion by Kennedy from his origins as a traditional cold warrior to his determination to pull the world back from the edge of destruction. Jim Douglas is an author. I know him somewhat also through the Catholic Workers Movement and his peace work over the years. His most recent book, JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters, was published in April of '08 by Orbis Books. From 1963 to '65, he served as a theological advisor on questions of nuclear war and conscientious objection to Catholic bishops at the Second Vatican Council in Rome. I mean, it must have been a tough job, Jim. He then taught theology at Bellarmine College, Louisville, Kentucky, the University of Hawaii, and the program in the program for the study and the practice of nonviolence at the University of Notre Dame. Jim and Shelley Douglas helped form Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action alongside the Trident submarine base in Seattle, Washington. He served a year and a half in jail for acts of civil disobedience at the Trident base. The Douglases and Ground Zero developed an extended community in 250 towns and villages and cities vigiling by the railroad tracks of the Trident nuclear weapons shipments. In September of '89, they moved to Birmingham, Alabama. From Birmingham, he's taken part in a series of peacemaking journeys to the Middle East and peace walks through Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan, and 5 visits to Iraq. In '93, the Douglases founded Mary's House, a Catholic worker house of hospitality in Birmingham for homeless families, and he has also written 4 books on the theology of nonviolence: The Nonviolent Cross, Macmillan, '68, Resistance and Contemplation, Doubleday in '72, Lightning, East to West, Crossroads, '83, and Nonviolent Coming of God, Orbis, '91. All 4 books have been republished by WIPF and Stock Publishers in Eugene, Oregon. So that's the distinguished guest we have to talk to us tonight. And we're glad that his search for the truth of theology and nonviolence has led him into the search for the truth of these assassinations. Jim Douglas.
Can everybody hear okay in terms of the mic? Thanks. I had to think a long time about what to say here tonight. I'm not primarily a researcher. I come at this from a different perspective maybe, and I don't have the expertise of probably 90% of the people or 100% of the people in this room. But so I finally, after thinking about what I could share with you, I decided to talk about hope and the hope of confronting the unspeakable in the assassination of President Kennedy. And well, let's see where it goes, and then maybe you can share your reflections on what I have to share. Concerned friends have asked me, as perhaps they've asked you as well, over the years, if engaging in such a probe into darkness as John Kennedy's assassination, has it made me profoundly depressed? But on the contrary, my experience has been, it's given me great hope. As Martin Luther King said, the truth crushed to earth will rise again. Gandhi spoke hopefully of experiments in truth because they take us into the most powerful force on earth and in existence, what he called truth force, satyagraha. That's how I think of this kind of work, as an experiment in truth, one that will open us up both personally and as a country to a process of nonviolent transformation. I believe this experiment we are doing into the dark truth of Dallas, and more significantly of Washington, can be the most hopeful experience of our lives. But as you know, it does require tenacity and patience to confront the unspeakable. We first of all need to take the time to recognize the sources in our history for what happened in Dallas on November 22, 1963. The doctrine of plausible deniability in an old government document provides us with a source of the assassination of President Kennedy. The document was issued in 1948, 1 year after the CIA was established, 15 years before JFK's murder. That document, National Security Council Directive 10/2, gave the highest sanction of the U.S. government to a broad range of covert operations: propaganda, sabotage, economic warfare, subversion of all kinds that were seen as necessary to win the Cold War against the communists. The government's condition for those covert activities by U.S. agencies coordinated by the CIA was that they be, as the document says, so planned and executed that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. In the 1950s, under the leadership of CIA Director Allen Dulles, the doctrine of plausible deniability became the CIA's green light to assassinate national leaders, conduct secret military operations, and overthrow governments that our government thought were on the wrong side in the Cold War. Plausible deniability meant our intelligence agencies, acting as paramilitary groups, had to lie and cover their tracks so effectively that there would be no trace of U.S. government responsibility for criminal activities on an ever-widening scale. The man who proposed this secret subversive process in 1948, diplomat George Kennan, said later, in light of its consequences, that it was the greatest mistake I ever made. President Harry Truman, under whom the CIA was created, and during whose presidency the plausible deniability doctrine was authorized, had deep regrets. He said in a statement on December 22, 1963, "For some time I have been disturbed by the way the CIA has been diverted from its original assignment. It has become an operational and at times a policy-making arm of the government. This has led to trouble and may have compounded our difficulties in several explosive areas. We have grown up as a nation respected for our free institutions and for our ability to maintain a free and open society. There is something about the way the CIA has been functioning that is casting a shadow over our historic process. and I feel that we need to correct it. Truman later remarked, "The CIA was set up by me for the sole purpose of getting all the available information to the president. It was not intended to operate as an international agency engaged in strange activities." President Truman's sharp warning about the CIA and the fact that warning was published 1 month to the day after JFK's assassination should have given this country pause. However, his statement appeared only in an early edition of the Washington Post, then vanished without comment from public view. What George Kennan and Harry Truman realized much too late was that in the name of national security, they had unwittingly allowed an alien force to invade a democracy. As a result, we now had to deal with a government agency authorized to carry out a broad range of criminal activities on an international scale, theoretically accountable to the president, but with no genuine accountability to anyone. Plausible deniability became a rationale for the CIA's interpretation of what the executive branch's wishes might be. But for the agency's crimes to remain plausibly deniable, the less said, the better, to the point where CIA leaders' creative imagination simply took over. It was all for the sake of winning the Cold War by any means necessary and without implicating the more visible heads of the government. One assumption behind Kennan's proposal unleashing the CIA for its war against communism was that the agency's criminal power could be confined to covert action outside the borders of the United States, with immunity from its lethal power granted to U.S. citizens. That assumption proved to be wrong. During the Cold War, the hidden growth of the CIA's autonomous power corresponded to the public growth of what was called a fortress state. What had been a struggling post-war democracy in our country was replaced by the institutions of a national security state. President Truman had laid the foundations for that silent takeover by his momentous decision to end the Second World War by a demonstration of nuclear weapons on the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to stop a Soviet advance to Japan. Truman's further post-war decision for U.S. nuclear dominance in the world, rather than allowing for international control of nuclear weapons, was his second disastrous mistake in terms of initiating the nuclear arms race in the world and subverting democracy in the USA. A democracy within a national security state cannot survive. The President's decision to base our security on nuclear weapons created the contradiction of a democracy ruled by the dictates of the Pentagon. A democratic national security state is a contradiction in terms. The insecure basis of our security then became weapons that could destroy the planet. To protect the security of that illusory means of security, which was absolute destructive power, we now needed a ruling elite of national security managers with an authority above that of our elected representatives. So from that point on, our military-industrial managers made the real decisions of state. President Truman simply ratified their decisions and entrenched their power, as he did with the establishment of the CIA and as his National Security Council did with its endorsement of plausible deniability. His successor, President Eisenhower, also failed to challenge in his presidency what he warned against at its end, the military-industrial complex. He left the critical task of resisting that anti-democratic power in the hands of the next president, John Kennedy. When President Kennedy then stood up to the Pentagon, the CIA, and the military-industrial complex, he was treated as a traitor. The doctrine of plausible deniability allowed for the assassination of a president seen as a national security risk himself. The CIA's plausible deniability for crimes of state, as exemplified by JFK's murder, corresponds in our politics to what the Trappist monk and spiritual writer Thomas Merton called the unspeakable. Merton wrote about the unspeakable in the 1960s, when an elusive, systemic evil was running rampant through this country and the world. The Vietnam War, the escalating nuclear arms race, and the interlocking murders of John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy were all signs of the unspeakable. For Merton, the unspeakable was ultimately a void, an emptiness of any meaning, an abyss of lies and deception. He wrote the following description of the unspeakable shortly after the publication of the Warren Report, which he could have been describing. He said, "The unspeakable is the void that contradicts everything that is spoken, even before the words are said. The void that gets into the language of public and official declarations at the very moment when they are pronounced, and makes them ring dead with the hollowness of the abyss." That's the Warren Report. The void of the unspeakable is the dark abyss. It's the midnight reality of plausible deniability that we face when we peer into our national security state's murder of President Kennedy. And that, I believe, is precisely where hope begins. Why President Kennedy was murdered can be, I believe, a profound source of hope to us all when we truly understand his story. Now, how can that possibly be? The why of his murder as a source of hope. Let's begin with the way Kennedy himself looked at the question. One summer weekend in 1962, while he was out sailing with friends, President Kennedy was asked what he thought of 7 Days in May. You remember 7 Days in May? A best-selling novel that described a military takeover in the United States. JFK said he'd read the book, and as you know, he was a very fast reader. And he came back the next day, and he said, yes, he'd read it, and then he discussed with his friends the possibility of their seeing just such a coup in the United States. These words were spoken by him after the Bay of Pigs and before the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, "It's possible. It could happen in this country, but the conditions would have to be just right. If, for example, the country had a young president and he had a Bay of Pigs, there would be a certain uneasiness. Maybe the military would do a little criticizing behind his back, but this would be written off as the usual military dissatisfaction with civilian control. Then if there were another Bay of Pigs, the reaction of the country would be, is he too young and inexperienced? The military would almost feel that it was their patriotic obligation to stand ready to preserve the integrity of the nation, and only God knows just what segment of democracy they would be defending if they overthrew the elected establishment." Pausing a moment, he went on, "Then if there were a third Bay of Pigs, it could happen." Waiting again until his listeners absorbed his meaning, he concluded with an old Navy phrase, "But it won't happen on my watch." Let's remember that JFK gave himself 3 strikes before he would be out by a coup, although he bravely said it wouldn't happen on his watch. As we know, and as the young President John Kennedy knew, he did have a Bay of Pigs. The president bitterly disappointed the CIA, the military, and the CIA-trained Cuban exile brigade by deciding to accept defeat at the Bay of Pigs rather than escalate the battle. Kennedy realized after the fact that he'd been drawn into a CIA scenario whose authors assumed he would be forced by circumstances to drop his advanced restrictions against the use of U.S. combat forces. He had been lied to in such a way that in order to win at the Bay of Pigs, he would be forced to send in U.S. troops. But JFK surprised the CIA and the military by choosing instead to accept a loss. They couldn't believe, he said, that a young president would make such a decision. We know how JFK reacted to the CIA setting him up. He was furious. When the enormity of the Bay of Pigs disaster came home to him, he said he wanted to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He ordered an investigation into the whole affair under the very watchful eyes of his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. He fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, Deputy Director Richard Bissell Jr., and Deputy Director General Charles Cabell. That was a huge decision, firing the top of the CIA's hierarchy, including the legendary leader who had come to personify the agency, Allen Dulles. The president then took steps to cut the CIA budget in 1962, again in 1963, aiming at a 20% reduction by 1966. John Kennedy was cutting back the CIA's power in very concrete steps by step. We know how the CIA and the Cuban exile community regarded Kennedy in turn because of his refusal to escalate the battle at the Bay of Pigs. They hated him for it. They did not forget what they thought was unforgivable. In terms of JFK's own analysis of the threat of an overthrow of his presidency, he saw the Bay of Pigs as the first strike against him. It was the first big stand he took against his national security elite, and therefore the first cause of a possible coup d'etat. However, in terms of our Constitution, our genuine security, and world peace, the position Kennedy took in facing down the CIA and the military at the Bay of Pigs, rather than surrendering to their will, was in itself a source of hope. No previous post-war president had shown such courage, or any president since then. Truman and Eisenhower had, in effect, turned over the power of their office to their national security managers. Kennedy was instead acting like he was the president of the country by saying a strong no to the security elite on a critical issue. If we, the people, had truly understood what he was doing then on our behalf, we would have thought the president's stand a deeply hopeful one. In terms of his 7 days in May analysis of a coming coup, John Kennedy did have a second Bay of Pigs. The president alienated the CIA and the military a second time by his decisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK had to confront the unspeakable in the missile crisis in the form of total nuclear war. At the height of that terrifying conflict, he felt the situation spiraling out of control, especially because of the actions of his generals. For example, with both sides on hair-trigger alert, the U.S. Air Force test-fired missiles from California across the Pacific, deliberately trying to provoke the Soviets in a way that could justify our superior U.S. forces blanketing the USSR with an all-out nuclear attack. As we know from Kennedy's secretly taped meeting with his Joint Chiefs of Staff on October 19, 1962, the chiefs were pushing him relentlessly to launch a preemptive strike on Cuba and ultimately the Soviet Union. In this encounter, the chiefs' disdain for their young commander-in-chief is summed up by a man whom John mentioned earlier, Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, when he says, LeMay says, we can hear it all on the tape, this blockade and political action is almost as bad as the appeasement of Hitler at Munich. I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this. And I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President. President Kennedy responds, what did you say? You're in a pretty bad fix.
President Kennedy, with a mocking laugh, "You're in with me." As the meeting draws to a close, Kennedy rejects totally the Joint Chiefs' arguments for a quick, massive attack on Cuba. The president then leaves the room, but the tape keeps on recording. 2 or 3 of the generals remain, and one says to LeMay, "You pulled the rug right out from under him, goddamn." LeMay with a chuckle, "Jesus Christ, what the hell do you mean?" Other general, "He finally got around to the word escalation. That's the only goddamn thing that's in the whole trick. Go in and out and get every goddamn one of the missiles. Escalation, that's it. Somebody's got to keep them from doing the goddamn thing piecemeal. That's our problem." The White House tapes show Kennedy questioning and resisting the mounting pressure to bomb Cuba coming from both the Joint Chiefs and the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. At the same time, John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the 2 men most responsible for the Cuban Missile Crisis, seemed locked in a hopeless ideological conflict. The U.S. and Soviet leaders had been following Cold War policies that now seem to be moving inexorably toward a war of extermination. Yet, as we have since learned, Kennedy and Khrushchev had been engaged in a secret correspondence for over a year that gave signs of hope, even as they moved publicly, step by step, toward a Cold War climax that would almost take the world over the edge with them. They were at the same time smuggling confidential letters back and forth that recognized each other's humanity and hoped for a solution. They were public enemies who, in the midst of deepening turmoil, were secretly learning something approaching trust in each other. I reread several of these letters yesterday. A man was asking me to reread them to him over the radio, and I was struck especially by the first things that Khrushchev says in his first letter to JFK when he's sitting by the Black Sea in his home, and he's looking out over the water, and it's a very beautiful letter, beginning of the letter especially. He looks out over the water and he reflects on what he's seeing and how what a contrast this is to what they're trying to address. And he says, "I want to suggest to you, Mr. President, a symbol of our problem." He says, this is Khrushchev, the communist, saying this, "It's Noah's Ark." He said, let's not try to distinguish who are the clean and the unclean on this ark, Mr. President. We're in a sea of nuclear weapons. Let's just keep the ark afloat. And Kennedy, after this letter was smuggled to him in a newspaper to his press secretary, who wondered, why do I want a newspaper given to me by a KGB agent? And he found out that there was a 28-page letter to the president inside it from Nikita Khrushchev. And when Kennedy responded to this, he was sitting by the Atlantic Ocean in Hyannisport, and he talks about the beauty there, and he says, yes, Mr. Chairman, Noah's Ark, that's our symbol. We have to keep the Ark afloat. We have to keep the Ark afloat. So even in the midst of the missile crisis, these 2 men had begun to, through their communications, their secret communications, they'd begun to almost beyond their intentions to develop a bit of trust in each other. So on what seemed the darkest day in the crisis, when a Soviet missile had shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba, intensifying the already overwhelming pressures on Kennedy to bomb Cuba, the president sent his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, secretly to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. RFK told Dobrynin, as Dobrynin reported to Khrushchev, that the president, quote, didn't know how to resolve the situation. The military is putting great pressure on him. Even if he doesn't want or desire a war, something irreversible could occur against his will. That is why the president is asking for help to solve this problem. In his memoirs, Khrushchev recalled a further chilling sentence from Robert Kennedy's appeal to Dobrynin. If the situation continues much longer, the president is not sure that the military will not overthrow him and seize power. The editor to Khrushchev's memoirs felt he had to stick in a footnote in there and say, there's no evidence of this, there's no evidence of this. Well, apparently the president thought there was some. Sergei Khrushchev, Nikita's son, who, as you probably know, is now in this country and a citizen, he's described his father's thoughts. His father described the thoughts to him when he read Dobrynen's wired report relaying John Kennedy's plea. The president was calling for help. That was how father interpreted Robert Kennedy's talk with our ambassador. So at a moment when the world was falling into darkness, Kennedy did what from his general standpoint was intolerable and unforgivable. JFK not only rejected the general's pressures for war, even worse, the president then reached out to their enemy asking for help. That was treason. When Nikita Khrushchev had received Kennedy's plea for help in Moscow, he turned to his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, and he said, "We have to let Kennedy know that we want to help him." Khrushchev stunned himself by what he just said. Did he really want to help his enemy Kennedy? Yes, he did. He repeated the word to his foreign minister. Yes, help. We now have a common cause to save the world from those pushing us toward war. How do we understand that moment? The two most heavily armed leaders in history, on the verge of total nuclear war, joined hands against those on both sides pressuring them to attack. Khrushchev ordered the immediate withdrawal of his missiles in return for Kennedy's public pledge never to invade Cuba and his secret promise to withdraw U.S. missiles from Turkey, as he would in fact do. By the way, I was in Rome, Italy at this time, and I didn't know, of course, the secret pledge that Kennedy had given to Khrushchev, or that he would in fact withdraw his missiles from Turkey. So I wrote an article for Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker newspaper, the most radical Catholic paper in the country, if not in existence. And I proposed what I thought was outrageous, and Dorothy published it right away, that what we should do is in exchange for Khrushchev withdrawing the missiles from Cuba, Kennedy should have had the guts to withdraw his missiles from Turkey. This was outrageous for this to even be suggested in the most radical publication I could find in my particular community. Kennedy did it. Kennedy did it. I remember that history. I remember what was unthinkable for him to do such a thing. The two Cold War enemies, both of them, had turned so that each now had more in common with his opponent than either had with his own generals. As a result of that turn toward peace, one leader would be assassinated 13 months later. The other, left without his peacemaking partner, would be overthrown the following year. Yet because of their turn away from nuclear war, today we are still living and struggling for peace on this earth. Hope is alive. We still have a chance. What can we call that transforming moment when Kennedy asked his enemy for help and Khrushchev gave it? From a Buddhist standpoint, it was enlightenment of a cosmic kind. Others might call it, from their perspective, a divine miracle. Readers of the Christian Gospels could say that Kennedy and Khrushchev, they were only doing what Jesus said, love your enemies. That would be love as Gandhi understood it, love as the other side of truth, a respect and understanding of our opponents that goes far enough to integrate their truth into our own. In the last few months of Kennedy's life, he and Khrushchev were walking that extra mile where each was beginning to see the other's truth. Neither John Kennedy nor Nikita Khrushchev was a saint. Each was deeply complicit in policies that brought humankind to the brink of nuclear war. Yet when they encountered the void that Merton, for example, was talking about, then by turning to each other for help, they turned humanity toward the hope of a peaceful planet. John Kennedy's next Bay of Pigs, his next critical conflict with his national security state, was what John was talking about, his American University address. Saturday Review editor Norman Cousins summed up the significance of that remarkable speech. At American University on June 10, 1963, President Kennedy proposed an end to the Cold War. I believe it is almost impossible to overemphasize the importance of President Kennedy's American University address. It was a decisive signal to both Nikita Khrushchev on the one hand and JFK's national security advisors on the other that he was serious about making peace with the communists. After he told the graduating class at American University that very important opening that John was just beginning to get into, he said, "What kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek?" He answered, "Not," emphasize, "not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war." Kennedy's rejection of a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war was an act of resistance to the military-industrial complex. Military-industrial complex was totally dependent on a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. That Pax Americana, policed by the Pentagon, was considered the system's indispensable, hugely profitable means of containing and defeating communism. At his own risk, Kennedy was rejecting the very foundation of the Cold War system. In its place as a foundation for peace, the president put a compassionate description of the suffering of the enemy, the Russian people. They had been our allies during World War II and had suffered mightily. Yet even their World War II devastation, he said, would be small compared to the effects of a nuclear war of both their country and ours. In his speech, Kennedy turned around the question. I heard this question all the time in the 1960s. Every time in the peace movement we tried to suggest alternatives. That question that was always asked when it came to prospects for peace was, what about the Russians? It was assumed the Russians would take advantage of any move we might make toward peace. Kennedy asked instead, what about us? He said, our attitude toward peace is as essential as theirs. What about our attitude toward war and the nuclear arms race? Within the overarching theology, the Cold War was a big theology, a theology of total good versus total evil. And you know who the total good is? It's us. Kennedy was asking a heretical question, coming especially from the President of the United States. Kennedy said he wanted to negotiate then a nuclear test ban treaty. Where do you want to do it? With the Soviet Union in Moscow. He wants to go to Moscow. He doesn't trust trying to negotiate a nuclear test ban treaty in Washington. He says, I want to go to Moscow, in their capital, not ours, as soon as possible. So to clear the way for such a treaty, what does he do? He said he was suspending U.S. atmospheric tests unilaterally. He's doing unilateral renunciation of his testing before anything with Khrushchev. John Kennedy's strategy of peace penetrated the Soviet government's defenses far more effectively than any missile could ever have done. The Soviet press, which was accustomed to censoring U.S. government statements, published the entire speech all across the country. Soviet radio stations broadcast and rebroadcast the speech to the Soviet people. In response to Kennedy's turn toward peace, the Soviet government even stopped jamming all Western broadcasts into their country. Everything is changing. Nikita Khrushchev was deeply moved by the American University address. He said Kennedy had given the greatest speech by any American president since Roosevelt. JFK's speech was received less favorably. Where? In his own country. The New York Times reported his government skepticism. They said, generally, there was not much optimism in official Washington that the president's conciliation address at American University would produce agreement on a test ban treaty or anything else. In contrast to the Soviet media that were electrified by the speech, the U.S. media ignored or downplayed it, as they've done to the present. For the first time, Americans had less opportunity to read and hear their president's words than did the Russian people. A turnaround was occurring in the world on different levels. Whereas nuclear disarmament had suddenly become feasible, Kennedy's position in his own government had become precarious. President Kennedy's next critical conflict with his national security state, propelling him toward the coup d'etat he saw as possible, number 4, was a partial nuclear test ban treaty that he signed with Nikita Khrushchev on July 25, 1963. Just 6 weeks, if you can imagine that, 6 weeks to negotiate that treaty after the American University address. The way he did it was he sent Averill Harriman as his representative to Moscow, and every time Averill Harriman, with the Soviet negotiators, had a question, he said, "Excuse me, please." He ran to a telephone, and he ran back with the answer. The telephone was directly to Kennedy. Kennedy negotiated that treaty point by point, personally, right straight through. That's why it happened in 6 weeks. And he did a total end run around his military advisors who were opposed to it. He didn't even consult them on it. He was fiercely determined, but he was not optimistic that the test ban treaty be ratified by the defense-conscious Senate. In early August, he told his advisors that getting Senate ratification of the agreement would be almost in the nature of a miracle. And we can understand, given what's happening in Congress today, what he faced in terms of, at the height of the Cold War, getting a nuclear test ban treaty through the Senate.